installation of our examination of the book of Exodus. Obviously, we're not going to get through the entire book of Exodus, but I may well decide to take it up again and slog on through because I find it to be absolutely fascinating stuff. But anyway, I passed out Bibles because we're going to actually, in order to understand what I'm going to be talking about today, you need to look at the text in the Bible. So would you grab a Bible and open it up to Exodus chapter 11. And as good Lutherans, you all know that Exodus is the second book of the Bible. So there you go. It's towards the front. Genesis chapter 11. And before I forget it, I want to draw your attention to a guest speaker that we have coming in next Saturday. She's going to be here next weekend. Dr. Jacqueline Lucy. She is going to be talking next Saturday night in Piper Hall about her new book, Love Without Limits. There's going to be a reception afterwards. The book will be on sale. You can have her sign it. And then I believe it's 2 weeks after that, we're actually going to have a discussion upstairs in the gathering room about Dr. Lucy's book. She also is going to teach an adult ed class on Sunday, next Sunday as well. It's going to be the only class, and I would encourage you to go and attend her class. So Saturday night at 7 o'clock, and then Sunday during the adult education hour, she's going to be she's going to be teaching as well. All right, so everybody at Genesis chapter 11. Okay. All right, just hold that thought right there, and let me start by looking at my notes here. It says a brief recap. So to set this in its historical or its context here, literary analysis of the text of Exodus shows that it is the work of three different sources. We've been talking about this all along. The Elohist source, not written, but in circulation at least by around the year 922 in the Northern Kingdom, probably not compiled and actually written down until later. The Yahweh source coming again in circulation around 850 in the Southern Kingdom of Judah, but again probably not compiled probably until the time of the exile. And then the priestly source written either during the exile or in the post-exilic period, anywhere from 587 down to about 450. We've been talking about those different sources all along. They're going to play a large role in our analysis today. These layers, that is, these different sources, are nowhere more apparent than in the narrative describing the final plague and the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians described in chapters 11 and 13. All right, now, you all got chapter 11 there. You got your finger on chapter 11? Yeah. Okay, chapter 11 begins to recount the 10th and final plague that God visited upon the Egyptians. This narrative is taken from the Elohist source, and it begins to describe the slaying of all the Egyptian firstborn, both human and animal. And you can see it's a short chapter, right? It's got, 9 verses? And the Lord says to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards, he will let you go. And then he says that, he says, I'm going to do this. But God also says, verse 7, he says, but not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, right? Not at people, not at animals, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Okay, so he's going to spare the Egyptians, or he's going to spare the Israelites, but he's going to slay all of the firstborn, human as well as animal, of the Egyptians. And we're just getting into it, and the chapter comes to an end. Right? Look at it. It just comes to an end. And this is really interesting. The account of the killing of all the Egyptian firstborn in chapter 11 is abruptly interrupted by the beginning of chapter 12, which gives instructions for several major annual rituals that were to be observed by the Israelites. The Feast of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You can see this is very disjointed, isn't it, right? Because we're talking about one thing and then all of a sudden we switch to another, right? So there's been some editing going on right here in this text. Okay, this material runs from 12:1 through 28, from the beginning of chapter 12, verse 1 down to verse 28. And then the narrative of the destruction of the firstborn of Egypt given by the Elohist only picks up again in chapter 12, verses 29 through 32. And then after that, the narrative returns to more instructions for the major annual rituals for the rest of chapter 12 and 13. So let me show you how this works, okay? Let me show you how this works. So chapter 11, the Lord says to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you away. And it goes on, Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the female slave who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of livestock. Then there will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, such as never has been or will be ever heard again. And then it goes on down, more warnings and stuff like this. Then we get the interruption there in chapter 12. If you turn now to chapter 12, verse 29, this is where it picks up again. Y'all, 12:29. Look at what it says. At midnight, remember Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out through the land of Egypt. Picks up again at 29. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. You see how the text has been interrupted right there? Okay? I mean, you're talking about the slaying of all the firstborn, and then you get these instructions for Passover and the eating of unleavened bread, and then the narrative picks up again about the death that is being brought upon the Egyptians by the firstborn. There's been some editing of the text right there, right? Something's been inserted. Y'all follow what I'm saying? Okay. Yeah. And so really you need to be looking at the text in order to understand this. Okay. So let's examine this. Let's examine what's going on. But before I do, you got any questions over that? Yeah, go ahead.
Why was the interruption?
Well, stay for the rest of the lecture. Okay. I've got 5 pages here and explain. That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. Why would
Poor editor.
Poor editor. Yeah. Well, I know. But it's jarring if you're reading along and whoa, and even the way in which it's written is different. I mean, it's just a different language altogether. Okay. So let's examine the inserted Passover ritual text in chapters 12 and 13. So, the text preserved by the Elohist source represents the oldest layer within these chapters. In other words, we're going to be talking here, inserted within and around the narrative of the slaying of the firstborn are instructions for the Passover, right? The sacrifice of the Passover lamb, and then the sprinkling of blood on the doorpost, and then the eating of unleavened bread. There are 2 versions of that. 2 versions of that. One is the oldest one, which is the Elohist version, and then there is a later version, which is the priestly version. Okay? So what we've got here is layer upon layer. Layer upon layer. But fortunately, people who are much smarter than I am have sorted all this out, and all I've done is just read what they had to say. But let's take a look at this. So, the Elohist account of the Passover sacrifice and blood ritual runs from 12:21 through 28. So turn to, in chapter 12, verses 21 through 28. Okay? So, let me see, 12:21 through 28. Yeah, okay, so, and here it is. This is the oldest text that we have of this. Then Moses called to the elders of Israel and said to them, Go, select lambs for all your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood of the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses or to strike you down. You shall observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. When you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this observance. Okay? That's the oldest text that we have instructing the Israelites to kill a lamb and sprinkle the blood on the doorpost. That's the oldest one. Probably goes all the way back to, who knows, 800, 900 BCE, something like that. Okay, that's the oldest one we have. The eating, the Elohist also has an account of the eating of unleavened bread, but we'll get to that in a bit. All right, so, okay, right here, yeah. This description of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread reveal that the knowledge of these 2 rituals and their association with the Exodus was known all the way back to, at least 722, because this is when the northern kingdom was destroyed, right? So at least by 722, but probably even a little bit earlier than that. So, what do we learn? The important elements to note in this description of the first, or the Egyptian Passover. First of all, It consists of the head of the household ritualistically slaughtering a lamb and then sprinkling its blood on the doorpost and lintel of the family home. We just read that, right? That's the instructions that have been given, Moses gave. When God passes by, specifically also, the spreading of the blood was to be done with a bunch of hyssop, right? That's a flour. You dip this flour in the blood and then sprinkle it on the lintel, or the lintel and the doorpost. When God passes by and sees the blood on the doorpost, he will not allow the destroyer to enter their homes or to strike them down. Okay, that's something else that's said right here. And then finally, this is interesting, the eating of the Paschal sacrifice, right, the eating of the Paschal lamb is not mentioned here. It may have been implied because it's called a sacrifice, and usually when a sacrifice was made, the sacrificial animal would be roasted and then it would be eaten. But it's not explicitly stated right here, so it may or may not have been a part of this. The other thing is that the Israelites are enjoined to observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. Okay, so those are sort of the significant things. Yeah, Bob.
So I'm curious about sort of the verbiage. I don't typically think of my Lord as the destroyer. So are these one and the same in this story?
Really good question. We'll get to that.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I wanted to read this is because of that verbiage right there, the destroyer. Right? Is this God or is this an agent of God? Yeah. Well, we'll get to that. That's really interesting. All right. So, in the description of the Feast of Unleavened Bread at chapter 13, verse 4, let's take a look at this. Go to chapter 13 and look at verse 4, okay? Everybody there? 13:4. Moses says, "Today in the month of Abib you are going out." Okay, so that dates, at least in the minds of the Israelites, when the Exodus took place. And we happen to know that the Hebrew word Abib means the month of the new grain. That's what it means. Literally, it means the month of the new grain harvest. And they're speaking specifically to barley. Okay, this is barley, the barley harvest, which occurred around the vernal equinox. In other words, in the springtime. Right? So it dates it. This is at least the Israelites believe that the Exodus took place around the time of the vernal equinox when the new barley was being harvested. Okay, so that's the date that we're playing with right here. This is important because it establishes a date not just for the Exodus but for this ritual, right? The ritual of the slaughtering of that Paschal lamb and the sprinkling of the blood on the doorpost. Okay, they seem to float around the vernal equinox. Okay, and for pastoral people, this would have also, and in other words, the early Israelites were a pastoral and farming people. This would have also been the time, or in springtime, around in April, late March, early April. Also the time when they would have been preparing to take their flocks to their summer pastures. So it's a period of transition. Okay. Period of transition. The barley's coming in, the barley's being harvested. We're getting the vernal equinox right here, and we're also preparing to take the flocks to their summer pasturage as well. Okay, so we got the date, at least the date in the minds of the Israelites when this took place. We've got a presumable date for when this ritual actually was being taken place as well. Let's go to the second layer describing the Passover event and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is supplied by the priestly author, okay? If the Elohist is using memory and using traditions that date from the New Kingdom, the Northern Kingdom, all the way back to 900 down to 722, the priestly author is writing either during the time of the exile, that is when the Jews have been taken captive and they're in Babylonia, and this happens in 587, or in the post-exilic period after they've come back, so that would date it from 530 down to about 450. So this is the priestly source is a much later source. Okay, still old, but much later. But before I go on to talk about the priestly source, you have any questions about this? Are y'all following? I mean, visual aids help a lot. They do. I mean, because you can see it right there in the text. Yeah. Although it's interesting because before I started reading this, I've read those passages 100 times, and I just sort of read. That makes sense. Pretty interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's take a look then at the priestly source. The priestly source right here. This actually runs. If you go back to chapter 12, verse 1, this is where the priestly source is inserted. And remember now, he is the one that gets the final say because the priestly source is the one who does the editing. Okay, so he puts his account of the Passover right at the beginning of chapter 12, ahead of that of the Elohist account. Okay, and it actually is a gloss. It's a gloss on the Elohist account. But let's see what he does with this. Okay, let's read this. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt. And already we got Aaron, right? And the priestly author loves Aaron because he's a priest and he's trying to trace his lineage all the way back to Aaron. So right there, right, we've got Aaron in the mix already. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Right there? Okay. This is in the Hebrew calendar. This is the month of Nisan. N-I-S-A-N, the month of Nisan, and it's the month of April. Okay, it's the month of April in the Hebrew calendar. It comes right around the time of the vernal equinox, all right? And it is actually the month of the new grain, okay? But so they've given it a name here, whereas Moses just said you're going out during the month of the new grain harvest. What we have here is, in a very priestly fashion, bam, very specifically, the month of Nisan. This is, and if you look at it right here, this is interesting right here. It shall be the first month of the year for you. That's puzzling because we all know that Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the new year for the Jews, right? Which they're just now celebrating, are they not? There's a difference. This is the beginning of the liturgical year right here, right? Just as we have, the beginning of our liturgical year is Easter, right? Okay, so it's not January 1st. I mean, the liturgical year actually begins at Easter time, right? And it goes through. This is the beginning of their liturgical year right here. Again, you see the priestly hand at work. This is what's important. Okay, all right. So let's go. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb. Again, very specifically. If you're a priest and you're all about ritual, you want to nail it down, don't you? Right? Okay. Tell them that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. And again, you can see the priest is not leaving anything to the imagination. Very, very specific about it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. So they go out, and on the 10th of the month, each family selects the sacrificial animal. It's either going to be a lamb or a goat. They're to keep it for 4 days, and then twilight of the 14th, all of the Israelites will go out, all the families, and they will slaughter their lamb at the same time. Okay, that's what he's saying right here. Okay, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts of the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. And there, very specifically, we're going to eat this, right? So we've got the Passover meal right here, very specifically laid out, okay? They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it. This is really interesting, right? He just doesn't leave anything to the imagination. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly, as if you were getting ready to leave Egypt, right? This is how he envisioned them actually eating it the first time, and they are to reenact this ceremony as they eat it. It is a Passover of the Lord, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you in the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Okay? So, the first laying out a first narrative of the Passover is the one from the Elohist, and although it has the sacrifice of the animal, a lamb, it calls it a Paschal lamb, and the sprinkling of the blood on the doorpost, it's a little bit vague on specifics, right? But the second one, which is written by a priest, is much more specific. We got the exact time, we've got the way in which you were supposed to eat it, how you're supposed to cook it. Everybody is supposed to partake of this. None of it can be left over until the morning. Very, very specific ritualistically. So you see the difference there. Okay. Any questions over this? All right. Well, yes. Several things jump out at us as we read the priestly account of the Passover. The priestly account is concerned with supplying specific ritualistic instructions and details. It also adds to the original smearing of the blood, the roasting and eating of the sacrificial lamb. It also adds to the original smearing of the blood, the roasting and eating of the sacrificial lamb. And what this tells us is that by the time that the priestly author is writing the second element of the Passover, the eating of the sacrifice had become the norm. Okay, whether it was included in the first one in the Elohist tradition or not, we don't know, but certainly by this time it is the norm. It's what the Jews are doing. Okay, now here's the question: where do these rituals come from? Where do these rituals come from? All right. Yeah, the smearing of the blood on the doorpost and the eating of the sacrificial lamb. Modern biblical scholarship tends to see the blood ritual, that is, the sacrifice of the animal, most often a lamb, but also they could use goats, the smearing of the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, as dating way back to the early history of the inhabitants of Canaan and known and practiced among the early Israelites. Okay, so there is a blood sacrifice and the smearing of the blood on the doors and on the lintels. This goes back to the earliest times of the Israelites and the Canaanites living in the land of Canaan. In identifying the origin of these very, very old rituals, the key is the insistence in both the Elohist source and the priestly source that the Exodus took place in the time of Abib, that is, at the time of the barley harvest in the month of Nisan. This places both the Exodus and the rituals in the early spring at the time of the vernal equinox. Now here is what tends to locate this ritual at a very specific time. The time of the equinox, the time of the vernal equinox among the ancient Israelites and the Canaanites was perceived as a time of heightened danger from evil, from spirits, danger, let me turn the page here, which threatened humans, flocks, and especially children. Remember, we're going to be killing the firstborn in Egypt, right? This was a very, very precarious time. And the reason for this was it was a time of flux. Things were changing. It's a liminal time, and in these stages where things are changing like this, these people believed that they were particularly susceptible to harm, to evil, to danger. Yeah, and in particular, Bob, there was a spirit known as the destroyer that may have been greatly feared because it preyed upon children. All right, the blood ritual, that is the sacrifice of an animal and the spreading of its blood on the entryways to homes, would have been carried out by the early inhabitants of the land in order to protect themselves, their flocks, and their children. Now the thinking is this, that by putting the blood on the doorpost and on the lintels, that as the evil spirits passed by, that they would be fooled into thinking that they had already taken the blood of a human being on the inside, right? That the blood on the outside would trick them and they would simply pass by. They would simply pass by, thinking that they'd already taken a life on the inside. The roasting and the eating of the flesh of the sacrificial animal would have been carried out in an effort to more closely associate individuals with the sacrificial victim, and thereby strengthening the ability of the blood to fool the demon or the evil out there. Makes sense, doesn't it? Right? So you, by partaking then of the flesh of that sacrificial victim, you're becoming one with it, and your blood then is mixed with its blood, and that blood out there on the doorpost then is going to save you and your family from harm. All right, questions or observations about this? And this is good anthropology. This is what anthropologists do, right? They make sense out of these rituals and things like this. Yes, Bob?
So in the second reading, though, of the story, it seems unambiguous that the destroyer is God or the Lord.
Yeah. This is the point then, does God, because God does say, I will pass by and I will slay the Egyptians, is the destroyer then some facet of God?
Yeah.
Or is the destroyer actually an angel carrying out? Because it's not specific. It says, I will not allow the destroyer. It says, I will not allow the destroyer to come into your home, right? And it's a little bit ambiguous right there.
In that first reading, yes.
Yeah.
But in the second one, in chapter 12, again, it's the Lord that's speaking.
That's right. Yeah.
And it keeps saying that
I will
strike down every firstborn of the land of Egypt.
Yeah. It's God that's doing it quite clearly. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because then as you just described, we then associate that entity with having this evil component.
Yeah, a facet of God who can destroy. Well, the question would be is, can God commit evil? And so this is, God is a just God, right? And so but it's really interesting because a lot of the Jewish commentators have struggled with this. How can you in fact give God a pass on this going in and destroying all those children and taking all those lives, right? They really struggle with this in a way that I don't think, we're bothered by it. Yeah.
Well, the whole sacrifice of the Passover is like a parable story of the life of Jesus.
Certainly.
I mean, it's the shedding of the blood, and it's...
Well, he's even referred to as a Paschal lamb, isn't he? Yeah. And, what he's doing, Jesus goes into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and the first night of Passover is Thursday night. That's when they hold the Seder, right? And he's passing around bread. Unleavened bread for them to eat. I mean, it's absolutely based on this right here. Yeah, and the New Testament Jews are not, the followers of Jesus are not shy about making that analogy between the Passover lamb and Jesus. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. In recounting the story of Exodus with its 10th and final horrible plague, the killing of the firstborn, the grafting on of these two rituals would not have been difficult. That is the slaying of the sacrificial victim and spreading its blood on the doorpost and the lintel, and then eating the victim itself. First off, these rituals would help explain why the destroyer would have spared the Israelites, right? Because they had carried out this ritual. Secondly, their inclusion in the Exodus story would have allowed the Israelites to continue to practice these important rituals of springtime protection even after they had dedicated themselves to the worship of Yahweh. Okay, so it's Yahweh then, as Bob picked up on, it's Yahweh in the priestly account who's going to carry out the killing of the firstborn. And the idea is, we can still practice, we're still celebrating the Passover, but in addition to protecting our firstborn, we're protecting ourselves from other harm as well by engaging in this. And thirdly, and again, Bob, thank you for bringing this up. The power that at one time had been vested solely in the performance of the two rituals was now attributed to the power and the protection of Yahweh, right? It's no longer the rituals in and of themselves that have the power to protect people, but Yahweh says, if you do this, right, if you do this, then I will spare you, right? So they take these rituals then that they've been accustomed to using, and they blend them in there with the Passover story of the sparing of the children in Egypt. Any questions about this? Wow. There's been a lot of angst spilt on all of this stuff. I mean, this is, the Hebrew commentators just spend tons and tons and tons of time talking about this because it's very important. Where does it come from and what does it mean and how should we handle this? All right, the other great feast then. So we've looked at the slaying of the Paschal lamb and the spreading of the blood on the lintels and the doorpost, and then the eating of the Paschal lamb. But there's another great a ritual that is intimately intertwined here with the Exodus, and that is the feast of the eating of unleavened bread, right? The feast of the eating of unleavened bread. The earliest account of the eating of unleavened bread runs from 12:33 and then 13:3 through 8. So let's look at this. Okay, so again, the oldest account, this is the oldest account, the earliest account. At 12:33, let me get there. 12:33, it says, 34. So the people, because they've been told to leave, right? So the people took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloaks on their shoulders, right? So yeah, you get this this picture of them hastily grabbing. The women have started making the bread the night before, and they put it into their kneading bowls. Probably got a towel over top of it. It hasn't risen yet. They grab it because they're leaving Egypt and they're fleeing out of their houses. We go to chapter 13 and we get a more measured and more detailed account of this. Let's start down here at chapter 13, verse 3. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by the strength of his hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today in the month of Abib, that is the month of the grain harvest, the first grain harvest, you are going out, that is in April, late March, April, anyway, the time of vernal equinox. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teachings of the Lord may be on your lips. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so that's the Elohist treatment of that. But the priestly author also included the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So let's go back to the beginning of chapter 12. Remember now, the priestly author has the last say in editing, and so he puts his material first. And we've already read chapter 12, verse 1 down through 13, and that's where he recounts the Passover, right? The slaying of the lamb, what they should do, and then the spreading of the blood and eating it. But he immediately continues at verse 14 by detailing the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. This is making the old priestly heart glad, right? You have to do this year after year after year after year. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day, okay, so we're getting very specific here, right? This is the priestly hand. He's telling them exactly what you have to do. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a solemn assembly, and on the seventh day a solemn assembly. No work shall be done on those days. Only what everyone must eat, that alone may be prepared by you. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your companies out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout your generation in a perpetual ordinance. In the first month, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, again, there's that priestly hand, very, very specific. You have to carry this ritual out precisely. You shall eat unleavened bread. For 7 days, no leaven shall be found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether an alien or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened, and all your settlements you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, so we're getting much more detail here from the priestly account. All right, any just upfront observations or questions about that? You've all read this a dozen times, you just never paid any attention to it, have you? This is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Okay. So, important elements to note in the description of this first or Egyptian feast of the eating of unleavened bread. At 1233, we get this rather, it's almost a charming account. The Israelites hurriedly leaving Egypt quickly grab their kneading bowls with the bread as yet unrisen, and so they scurry out. So there we have it, right? They're taking their unleavened bread out. We also find in chapter 13, verse 8, that the feast shall be remembered and celebrated in the month of Abib. It will last 7 days. For 7 days, the Elohist says, the Israelites shall not eat unleavened bread, and they shall also destroy anything else with leaven in it that they may possess. Now, the priestly account pretty much parallels that, but just gets a little bit more specific. Important elements to note in this description of the first or Egyptian feast of the eating of unleavened bread. He states it shall be a perpetual ordination and celebration, right? And at the time he's writing, the priests were in control of this, right? The priests were in control of it. Remember, Jesus has to go down to Jerusalem and celebrate Passover at the temple in Jerusalem, right? The priests have come to dominate this, okay? Anyone also will be observed for 7 days. Anyone who eats unleavened bread during this period will be cut off from the community. You can see the priestly control right there, right? We're going to exclude people. The observance will be bookended by a solemn assembly. It will be public, and at the time he's writing, probably it will be held around the temple in Jerusalem. On the temple in Jerusalem. Nothing with leaven in it may be consumed in this period. So, what are the origins of this observance, of this ritual, the feast of eating of unleavened bread? The key to understanding the origins of this ritual is the notation in the narrative that the Exodus occurred in the month of Abib. This indicates that in its earliest form, this festival was a springtime festival or ritual. At the time of the vernal equinox, it was also a time of renewal, a new harvest, taking the flocks to summer pasturage. And the emphasis on this ritual, and this is interesting, is on not eating or touching anything with leaven in it. Why would that be? Why would that be? Because think about this. What does leaven do? Leaven, if you put, it's yeast, right? If you put yeast in bread, it makes it puffy. It blows it up, right? It blows it up and makes it puffy. If you put yeast in grapes, what does it do? Or in wheat, it turns it into alcohol, doesn't it? Okay. And the thinking is that these things were taboo because of what they symbolize to the ancient Israelites at this time. Leaven produces puffed up bread. It also causes fermentation in beer and wine. In these instances, there is a symbolism of pride and arrogance with the puffed up bread and the potential in alcohol for sin and transgression. Don't take my word for it. Let's listen to what St. Paul says about this. St. Paul at 1 Corinthians 5:6, and I'm quoting here from St. Paul, and he's writing to the Corinthians, "Your boasting is not a good thing. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens a whole batch of dough?" A little bit of pride then is just going to puff everything up right there. "Clean out the old yeast so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened." Right? You shouldn't be puffy. You shouldn't have that yeast in there. You shouldn't be puffed up with pride. "For our Paschal lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed." In other words, we have sacrificed the lamb. Now we must observe unleavened bread. Right? That's what he's saying right here. He's playing off of this Jewish ritual right here. "Therefore, let us celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Right there. That's that ritual right there. Right? We are shunning then. We're shunning the old. We're not going to be puffed up. This is why it's symbolic. You don't want to be puffed up with pride. You don't want to have any vestiges of evil or sin in you. And so it's not just that if you're an Israelite, it's not just that you are supposed to eat unleavened bread, but you are literally supposed to clean anything with leaven that you have in your house out and destroy it. All yeast must die. Right? All yeast cultures must be destroyed. Right? It's going to be a completely new beginning. Completely new beginning. Okay. Oh, and you don't believe me. So let's see what Jesus himself says. Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 through 6. And when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Right? And you never knew what that meant, did you? But now you do. And it means they're puffed up, right? They're boastful, they're prideful, right? They're arrogant. And this is why they can't eat leavened bread over the Passover. You're getting rid of that. You're expunging that. That's what you're doing, right? Okay.
Ron, but
Yes.
it didn't mean that they were afraid they might sneak in some leavened bread in place of the unleavened. It was the puffing up that was the object of that.
Well, it's what it symbolizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're doing this ritual
That's what
because
I mean,
what you're doing is you're symbolizing by not eating leavened bread that you yourself you're going to engage in this new beginning. Because you're destroying all the old yeast, right? Mm-hmm. And that you yourself are going to be like that unleavened bread. You're not going to be puffed up and puffed. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Yeah. By avoiding leaven for 7 days, the Israelites would have been attempting to put off the old puffiness and pride and purging the old sin and old sinful ways and even the temptation to sin. This ceremony then represented a renewal, a new beginning, a starting over. The crafting of this ancient ritual onto the Exodus account would not have been difficult. Think about this. The Israelites are about to enter into a new stage of their existence, right? This is it's like the flocks that are going to be led out during springtime to their summer pasturage. The same thing here with the Israelites. They are starting a new stage in their existence. They are going to leave Egypt and travel to the land of Canaan. They are going to purge themselves of their old sins and transgressions and thus present themselves holy and pure before Yahweh. This is what the observance of unleavened bread, not eating leavened bread means. They will then do this annually in commemoration of their deliverance from the Egyptians as well. Okay. All right, any questions over there? Yes, Don?
I'm just curious, the modern Jews that observe Passover, you say this is rather disjointed the way it's written. Is their Bible the same as this?
It is. But there's a verbal Torah as well as a written Torah, right? The Mishnah, that the rabbis have commented on for years and years and years. And what the Mishnah does is it smooths out all these inconsistencies and it gives it sort of a coherent whole, right? And that's what they follow, because the Seder is the opening of Passover. What they do is they recount the steps of Passover itself, and then the fleeing out of Egypt into the Holy Lands, and it's very logical and it's very orderly, unlike what you have here. So it's based on this, but they really rely on the oral Torah at that point. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? So, characteristics of the priestly author writing in the exilic period. Now, this is important. This is very important because, again, I want to stress this. It's the priestly author who has the last say in all this. He's the one that's ordered this. He's the one that put his material first, and he's the one that needs to make sense out of this. If he or they are writing during the exile, that is, while the Israelites are in Babylon, the aim was to give encouragement and to strengthen the Jews living as captives there. In other words, remember that God once freed your ancestors. He can do this again. And also to demonstrate Yahweh's ability to care for and release them from his people. And also to emphasize the need for the correct observance of rituals and ceremonies in order to please God. If you want to get out of this bondage, then what you need to do, because again and again the text says you need to observe this. You need to observe this, right? It has to be observed correctly, and if you do this, you will please Yahweh, and Yahweh then will lead you out of bondage. However, if he's writing during the post-exilic period, you can see that they tend to push for the elevation of the priest and the worship of Yahweh at the temple, and also there's an emphasis on the need for the correct observance of rituals and ceremonies in order to please God. This would take place at the temple in Jerusalem, and you can see both. You could read both of these sort of temporal elements in here. Well, if he's writing during the exile, that is, if the priestly author is writing while the Israelites are in Babylon, this would explain why the priestly source would essentially gloss the account given by the Elohist source, written much earlier, which located the Passover ritual in private homes, right? The first Egyptian ritual, Moses tells the people, do this at your home, right? Do this at your home. Okay. This is strange because by the time that he's writing, if it's in the post-exilic period, the Passover has been shifted to focus on the temple. Remember, Jesus doesn't celebrate this up there in Nazareth. He has to go to Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover with a ritualistically slaughtered lamb there in Jerusalem, right? Okay. Why then, if that's the case, why didn't the priestly author sort of tweak it to say, well, the first Passover really took place around some temple or something like that? No, he doesn't do that. Well, maybe by this time, this account of the private Passover in Egypt was well known. It had been around for a long, long time. It was, the Elohist was recording a practice which had been common in the northern kingdom, but that kingdom had been destroyed by the Assyrians in the year 722. In the southern kingdom of Judah, beginning with King Solomon and then under King Hezekiah and Josiah, the push for religious centralization had occurred. Under both Hezekiah and Josiah, we know this from the Old Testament, the Passover ritual of sacrifice and blood marking had occurred, but they had been performed at the temple in Jerusalem with a Levite priest presiding. Okay, so the Passover, we have references to the Passover being celebrated by both of these kings here in the Old Testament. It may well be that the priestly authors had nothing to fear from reproducing a gloss on E's account of the Egyptian Passover, since there was now in their day no chance of a revival of this ritual taking place in private homes. This is how it had been way back then, and we all know that. But the people who really practice that in the northern kingdom aren't even around anymore. We living down here in the southern kingdom, we will gather at the temple. Okay. All right. pretty complicated, it's fascinating stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's it. That's all I have for you. I really would like to get through the book of Exodus. It's not going to happen, probably not for another 12 months, but just stick around. Because it's good stuff. It's really, really good stuff. And I really, just for I'm being very selfish about this. I'm doing this for me, not for you. But I'd be willing to take you along if you want to come. All right, so remember Dr. Lucy, next, I erased her, next Saturday, okay? All right, thanks.
Thank you.